gate slammed shut so hard that snow fell from the stone archway above it. Elena Whitfield stood on the wrong side of that gate, her thin dress already soaked through, her bare hands turning white in the wind. Behind her, inside the warm glow of the Ashford Manor, Lady Margaret Ashford watched through the frost-covered window, with her arms crossed, satisfied that the matter was finally settled. "You will not set foot on this land again," Lady Margaret had said only minutes before, her voice cold enough to match the storm outside. "A thief has no place under my roof." Elena had not stolen the silver necklace. She had said so, over and over, until her voice cracked, and her knees nearly buckled from the weight of the accusation. Nobody had listened. Nobody ever listened to a servant girl, when a member of the family pointed a finger and called it truth. Now she stood alone on the frozen road that led away from the estate, with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a small bundle of bread she had grabbed from the kitchen, before Nathaniel the footman pushed her out the door. The wind cut through her like a blade. Snow fell in thick sheets, turning the world into a wall of white. She could not see more than a few steps ahead. She could not feel her fingers. She did not know where she would sleep that night, or if she would survive to see morning. She started walking, because standing still meant freezing where she stood. What Elena did not know, what none of the Ashfords realized as they turned away from their windows and returned to their warm fires, was that a rider had stopped at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the estate wall, only moments before the gate opened. He had been passing through on his way to inspect landholdings nearby, his black horse cutting a lonely path through the storm. When he saw the gate swing open and a young woman thrown out into the blizzard, he pulled his horse to a stop and watched. His name was Duke Alaric Thorne, and every household within 3 counties knew his name, though almost none of them knew his face. He was spoken of in hushed voices at dinner tables, called cold, called ruthless, called a man who had no patience for weakness, and even less for excuses. Merchants trembled when his seal appeared on a letter. Rivals avoided crossing his path. Servants in his own household were said to flinch at the sound of his boots on the stone floor. But watching from the shadows of the pine trees, hidden by the storm, Alaric did not feel cold or ruthless. He felt something closer to disbelief. He watched the girl stumble forward into the snow, watched her small frame nearly disappear into the whiteness, and something in his chest tightened in a way he did not expect and did not welcome. He told himself it meant nothing. People were banished from estates all the time. It was not his business what the Ashfords did with their servants. He had his own matters to attend to, his own reasons for traveling through this stretch of countryside, in weather no sensible man would choose to travel in. He nudged his horse forward, intending to continue on his way, and forget what he had seen. But he did not continue on his way. Instead, he found himself turning his horse toward the road Elena had taken, following at a distance, telling himself he only wanted to be certain she did not collapse in a ditch somewhere and freeze before anyone found her. That was reasonable, he told himself. That was simply the decent thing to do. It had nothing to do with the way her voice had carried through the wind when she pleaded her innocence, or the way she had not begged, not really, but had simply stated the truth, again and again, as if truth alone should have been enough. Elena, unaware that she was being followed, pressed onward through the storm. The road beneath her feet had long since vanished under the snow, and she found herself guessing at the path, using the black shapes of trees on either side to keep from wandering into open field, where she would surely be lost. Her lungs burned with every breath of frozen air. Her legs ached from the effort of pushing through drifts that reached her knees in places. She thought of her mother, who had died 3 winters ago, from a fever that no doctor could cure. She thought of the small room she had slept in at the Ashford estate for the past 2 years, cramped and cold as it was. At least it had been shelter. She thought of Lady Margaret's face, twisted with false outrage, as she held up the necklace and demanded to know how a servant girl could explain finding it hidden among her things. Elena had never seen that necklace before, the moment it was placed in her hands by the housekeeper, Mrs. Bellwether, who had discovered it during a search of the servants' quarters. She remembered the look on Mrs. Bellwether's face, a flicker of doubt, gone as quickly as it appeared. Even the housekeeper, who had known Elena for 2 years and had never once caught her in a lie, did not speak up in her defense. Nobody had spoken up. Not one person in that entire household had stepped forward to say that the accusation made no sense, that Elena had never given anyone reason to doubt her honesty. They had all stood silent while Lady Margaret condemned her, and they had all stood silent while she was pushed out into the storm. The unfairness of it burned hotter than the cold, at least for a while. But as the hours passed, and the temperature continued to drop, even her anger began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that frightened her more than the cold itself. She knew what happened to people who gave in to that kind of tiredness in weather like this. She had heard stories of travelers found frozen along roadsides, their faces peaceful, as if they had simply decided to rest and never woken. She would not let that happen to her. She repeated this to herself, with every labored step, using the words like a rope to pull herself forward. She would not let that happen. She would find shelter. She would survive this night. And tomorrow she would find some way to prove her innocence. Some way to make the world see the truth, even if the Ashfords never would. But the storm showed no mercy for her determination. The wind grew stronger, driving snow sideways into her face, stinging her eyes until she could barely keep them open. She stumbled over a root hidden beneath the snow and fell hard onto her knees, the impact jarring through her entire body. For a moment, she simply knelt there, gasping, the cold seeping up through her thin dress from the snow beneath her. "Get up," she told herself. "Get up now." She pushed herself back to her feet, swaying, and continued forward, though her pace had slowed considerably. The trees around her seemed to close in tighter, the path narrowing, until she was no longer certain she was following any road at all. Panic began to creep into the edges of her mind, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the weather. What if she was lost? What if she had wandered off the road entirely and was now walking deeper into the forest instead of toward the nearest village? She stopped and turned in a slow circle, searching for any landmark, any sign of which direction led back toward safety. There was nothing but white in every direction, the snow falling so thick now that she could barely see her own outstretched hand. Fear, real and consuming, finally broke through the numbness that had carried her this far. She called out, though she knew there was no one to hear her, her voice swallowed instantly by the howling wind. She took a step forward, then another, no longer certain if she was moving toward help or further into danger. Her legs gave out beneath her without warning. One moment she was walking, and the next she was on the ground, the snow soft and strangely warm against her cheek, though she knew that warmth was a lie her body was telling her, the last trick of a mind giving up against the cold. She thought distantly that she should get up, that lying still in the snow was the very thing she had promised herself she would not do. But her body would not obey. Her eyes began to close, the world around her fading into a gray blur at the edges. The wind seemed to grow quieter, though she knew it had not actually softened at all. She thought of her mother's face, and then she thought of nothing at all. It was in that moment, as Elena's eyes closed and the storm threatened to claim her, that Duke Alaric Thorn finally caught sight of her through the trees ahead. He had been following her tracks for the better part of an hour, growing more concerned with every passing minute as the storm worsened and her footprints grew more uneven, more staggered, clear signs of a body losing its fight against the cold. When he saw her collapse, he did not hesitate. He spurred his horse forward through the deep snow, closing the distance in seconds that felt impossibly long. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, dropping to his knees beside her still form. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the coldness that so many people claimed defined him. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck and felt, with a wave of relief that surprised him with its intensity, the faint but steady pulse beneath her frozen skin. She did not answer. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that told him he had very little time to act. He pulled off his own heavy coat and wrapped it around her, then lifted her from the snow with an ease that spoke of considerable strength, cradling her against his chest as he carried her back toward his horse. "You are not dying in my forest," he muttered, more to himself than to her, as he settled her carefully in front of him on the saddle and pulled the coat tighter around her small frame. "Not tonight." He knew of a hunting lodge not far from where they now stood, a modest stone building he kept for the rare occasions when he wished to escape the pressures of managing his estate. It would have a fire ready to be lit, blankets, and shelter from the storm that continued to rage around them. He turned his horse toward it, holding Elena steady against him as they pushed forward through the snow. She stirred once during the ride, a small movement, a faint sound that might have been a word or might have simply been a breath. He glanced down at her pale face, framed by dark hair now dusted with snow, and felt again that strange tightening in his chest that he could not name, and did not wish to examine too closely. Whoever she was, whatever had led to her banishment into this storm, he intended to see her safely warmed and fed before he asked a single question. The rest could wait until morning. For now, survival was the only thing that mattered, and Alaric found himself more determined to secure hers than he had been to secure anything in a very long time. The lodge appeared through the trees like a small miracle, its stone walls dusted white but solid against the wind. Alaric brought his horse to a stop at the door and dismounted quickly, lifting Elena down with careful arms before pushing the heavy wooden door open with his shoulder. Inside, the air was still and cold, but at least it was free of the biting wind. He laid Elena down on a bench near the unlit fireplace and immediately set to work building a fire, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times before, though usually only for himself. The flames caught quickly, and within minutes, a warm glow began to fill the small room. Alaric pulled a woolen blanket from a chest near the wall and laid it over Elena, tucking it around her shoulders the way one might tend to a child. He studied her face in the firelight, noting the exhaustion etched into her features even in unconsciousness, the faint scar above her eyebrow, the chapped redness of her lips from the cold. He did not know her name. He did not know what she had supposedly stolen, or from whom, or whether the accusation held even a grain of truth. All he knew was that she had been cast out into a storm that could easily have killed her, and that something about the entire scene had struck him as deeply, unmistakably wrong. Alaric was not a man who acted on impulse. He had built his reputation on careful calculation, on weighing every decision against its consequences before committing to a course of action. And yet here he was, in a lodge miles from his own estate, tending to a stranger he had followed through a blizzard, for reasons he still could not fully explain to himself. He settled into a chair near the fire, close enough to watch over her, but far enough to give her space when she woke. Outside, the storm continued to howl against the stone walls, but inside, warmed by the fire and the shelter of solid walls, there was at least a fragile kind of peace. Elena's breathing began to even out, as the warmth of the room worked its way into her body. Color slowly returned to her lips, and the tension in her frozen limbs began to ease. Alaric watched this transformation with quiet relief, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, unwilling to examine too closely why her recovery mattered to him as much as it seemed to. Hours passed. The fire crackled steadily, and the storm outside showed no signs of relenting. Alaric remained in his chair, occasionally rising to add wood to the flames, or to check the pulse at Elena's wrist, reassuring himself with each check that she remained stable, that the worst danger had passed. It was well past midnight when Elena finally stirred, her eyelids fluttering open to a room she did not recognize, lit by a fire she had not built, wrapped in a blanket that was not her own. For a moment, disoriented and still groggy from exhaustion, she simply stared at the ceiling above her, trying to piece together how she had come to be here. Then she remembered the storm, the collapse, the cold pulling her down into darkness, and she remembered nothing after that. She turned her head and saw him sitting near the fire, a tall figure with dark hair and sharp features, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. For a moment, fear flickered through her, the instinctive wariness of a woman who had just been cast out by people she trusted, now waking in the presence of a stranger in an unfamiliar place. "You are safe," he said quietly, his voice low and steady, meant to reassure rather than alarm. "You collapsed in the snow. I found you and brought you here." Elena tried to sit up, but her body protested with a wave of dizziness, and she sank back against the bench with a soft gasp. He rose from his chair and crossed to her side, though he kept a careful distance, respecting whatever boundary she needed in this uncertain moment. "Rest," he said. "You are safe here. There is a fire, and I will not let any harm come to you." She studied his face in the firelight, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that his words carried a hidden threat. But all she found was quiet concern, and something else she could not quite name, something that made her chest ache in a way she did not understand. "Who are you?" she finally managed to ask, her voice hoarse from the cold and the hours of silence. He hesitated for only a moment before answering. "You may call me Alaric," he said, leaving out the title that would have changed everything about how she looked at him. "And you are safe. That is all that matters tonight." Elena did not know it yet, but the storm, that had nearly taken her life, had also led her directly into the path of a man whose name alone struck fear into the hearts of an entire region. She did not know that the quiet stranger tending to her by the fire was the very Duke so many people whispered about with dread. All she knew, as her eyes grew heavy once more, was that for the first time since the gate had slammed shut behind her, she finally felt something close to safe. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to the quiet transformation taking place within those stone walls. But inside, something had shifted, something neither Elena nor Alaric could yet name, though both would come to understand it in the days that followed. The gate had closed behind her, banishing her from everything she had known. But another door had opened, one she could not yet see clearly, leading toward a truth far larger than either of them realized on that first frozen night. Morning light crept through the small window of the hunting lodge, pale and gray, filtered through snow that still clung to the glass. Elena woke slowly this time, her body aching in places she did not know could ache, but the bone-deep cold from the night before had finally released its grip on her. She lay still for a moment, listening to the crackle of the fire, before memory returned in full force. She had been thrown out into a storm. A stranger had saved her. She was in a lodge she did not recognize, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. She sat up carefully this time, testing her strength before committing to the movement. The dizziness from the night before had faded, replaced by a dull hunger that reminded her she had not eaten a proper meal in almost a full day. She glanced around the small room and found it empty. The chair where the man called Alaric had been sitting was vacant, though the fire still burned steadily, meaning he had not been gone long. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and rose to her feet, testing her balance before taking a few slow steps toward the fire. The warmth of the flames felt like a small miracle after the previous night, and she held her hands out toward it, watching the color slowly return to her fingertips. The door opened behind her, and she turned quickly, her heart jumping in her chest before she recognized the tall figure stepping inside, snow dusting his dark coat and his boots leaving wet prints on the stone floor. "You are awake," Alaric said, closing the door behind him against the cold. He carried a small sack in one hand, which he set down on the wooden table near the wall. "I went to check the horses and found some provisions in the storage shed. Bread, dried meat, a little cheese. It is not much, but it will help." Elena watched him with cautious eyes, still uncertain how to feel about the stranger who had pulled her from the snow. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words feeling inadequate for what he had done. "I do not know how to repay you for what you did last night." "You owe me nothing," he said simply, unpacking the small sack and laying the food out on the table. "Come and eat. You will need your strength." She hesitated only a moment before crossing to the table, her hunger finally overriding her caution. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, pulling the blanket around her like a shawl as she reached for a piece of bread. He sat across from her, watching with quiet attention as she ate, though he made no comment on the way her hands trembled slightly, whether from cold or from the shock of everything that had happened. "You were banished," he said after a long silence, his tone careful, neither accusing nor demanding. "From the estate near the eastern road, I saw the gate close behind you." Elena's hands stilled over the bread. She looked up at him, searching his face for judgment, but found only patience waiting for her to speak if she chose to. "You saw that?" "I did," he admitted. "I was passing through when it happened. I did not intend to interfere, but I could not simply ride on and leave you to the storm." She studied him for a long moment, weighing how much to share with a man whose full name she still did not know. But something in his manner, steady and unhurried, made her feel that honesty would not be met with the same cruelty she had faced from the family that raised her from childhood into service. "They said I stole a necklace," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "A silver necklace that belonged to Lady Ashford. I never saw it before the day it was found among my things. I do not know how it got there, but I swear to you, I did not take it." Alaric listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable but attentive. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "Do you have any idea who might have placed it there?" he asked. Elena shook her head slowly. "I have thought about little else since it happened. I cannot imagine who would want to see me blamed for something I did not do. I have never had trouble with anyone in that household. I kept to myself, did my work, and tried to give no one reason to notice me at all." And yet someone noticed you enough to want you gone, Alaric said quietly, almost to himself. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She had not considered it in those terms before, had been too consumed by shock and grief over the injustice of it to think carefully about motive. But he was right. Someone had wanted her gone badly enough to plant evidence and let an entire household believe a lie. Who would benefit from your absence? Alaric asked, leaning forward slightly, his sharp eyes studying her, with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time, that someone was truly listening to her, truly trying to understand, rather than simply passing judgment. Elena thought carefully, running through the faces of the household in her mind. The Ashford family was large, with several cousins and distant relatives often visiting or staying for extended periods. She thought of Lord Edmund Ashford, kind but often absent, too consumed with business matters to notice the daily workings of his household. She thought of Lady Margaret, sharp-tongued and quick to judge, but Elena had never given her any particular reason for personal dislike, beyond the ordinary friction between mistress and servant. And then she thought of Gareth Ashford, a cousin of Lord Edmund, who had been staying at the estate for the past several months, ostensibly to help manage some of the family's business affairs, while recovering from what he described as financial troubles of his own. Elena had noticed, though she had never spoken of it to anyone, that Gareth often seemed to watch the household staff with an unusual interest, that he had once asked her several oddly specific questions about which servants had access to which rooms, and when. "There is a cousin," she said slowly. "Gareth Ashford. He has been staying at the estate for some months. I never trusted him fully, though I could never say exactly why. He asks strange questions sometimes, about who went where in the house, and at what hours." Alaric's expression sharpened slightly at this information, though he said nothing immediately, simply filing the detail away with the careful precision of a man accustomed to gathering facts before drawing conclusions. "Tell me more about him," he said. Elena continued, describing what little she knew of Gareth's circumstances, his frequent private meetings with Lord Edmund regarding money matters, the way he seemed both charming and calculating in equal measure, the way servants often felt uneasy in his presence, without being able to articulate exactly why. As she spoke, Alaric listened with growing interest, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in his mind. He had dealt with enough dishonest men in his years managing his own estate to recognize the pattern she described. A man in financial difficulty, ingratiating himself into a wealthy household, watching for opportunities that might benefit his own circumstances at the expense of others. "It is possible," he said carefully, once she had finished, "that your cousin Gareth had reasons of his own to want suspicion directed away from himself and towards someone else. If he took the necklace himself, planting it among your belongings would deflect any inquiry that might otherwise fall upon him." Elena's breath caught. She had not considered this possibility so directly, though something about it settled into place with unsettling clarity. "You think he stole it himself and blamed me to protect his own position in the household?" "It is a theory," Alaric said, "not yet a certainty, but it fits what you have described, and it would explain why an otherwise ordinary theft resulted in such swift and severe punishment for you. If Lady Ashford believed the true culprit had been found and dealt with, she would have no reason to look further, and Gareth would remain safely above suspicion." Elena sat back in her chair, the weight of this possibility settling over her like a heavy blanket. If Alaric was right, then not only had she been wrongly accused and cruelly banished, but the true thief remained comfortably within the household, likely congratulating himself on how neatly his plan had unfolded. "How could we ever prove such a thing?" she asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "It would be my word against his, and my word has already been proven worthless in that household." "Not your word alone," Alaric said, and something in his tone made her look up at him with curiosity. "There are ways to investigate such matters quietly, without revealing intentions before the evidence is gathered. I have some experience in these affairs, more than you might expect." Elena studied him carefully, noticing again the quiet authority in his bearing, the careful way he chose his words, the confidence that suggested a man accustomed to being obeyed rather than questioned. She had assumed, based on his simple clothing and modest manner at the lodge, that he was perhaps a merchant or a landholder of moderate means. But something about the way he spoke now made her wonder if there was more to him than he had revealed. "Who are you, really?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could reconsider it. Alaric's expression flickered, something passing behind his eyes that she could not quite name. Hesitation, perhaps, or reluctance. "Does it matter?" he asked quietly. "I am someone who found you in the snow and wishes to help you find the truth. Is that not enough for now?" Elena considered this and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was. Whatever his true circumstances, whatever reasons he had for keeping certain details private, he had shown her nothing but kindness and careful attention since the moment he found her collapsed in the storm. She was not in a position to demand more from him than he was willing to give, not when he had already given her shelter, warmth, food, and the first genuine hope she had felt since the gate slammed shut behind her. "For now," she agreed, "it is enough." They spent the remainder of the morning discussing the details of the Ashford household, Elena sharing everything she could remember about the routines and relationships within the estate, while Alaric listened carefully, occasionally asking pointed questions that helped clarify small details she might otherwise have overlooked. He had a way of drawing information out of her gently, without pressure, that made the conversation feel less like an interrogation and more like two people working together toward a shared goal. By midday, the storm outside had begun to weaken, the heavy snowfall reducing to a gentler drift, though the wind still carried a biting chill. Alaric rose from the table and crossed to the window, studying the sky with a practiced eye. "The worst of it has passed," he said, "but the roads will remain difficult for at least another day, perhaps two. We should remain here until it is safe to travel." Elena nodded, though a flicker of anxiety crossed her mind at the thought of what awaited her once the storm finally cleared. She had no home to return to, no household willing to take her in, nothing but the clothes on her back and the growing hope that perhaps, with this stranger's help, she might yet find a way to clear her name. "What happens after the storm passes?" she asked quietly. "I have nowhere to go. No family, no position, nothing." Alaric turned from the window to look at her, and for a moment, his carefully composed expression softened into something gentler, something that made her chest tighten with an emotion she could not name. "You will not be left to fend for yourself," he said firmly. "I give you my word on that. Whatever else happens, you will have shelter and safety until this matter is resolved, and beyond that if necessary." Elena felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes, the accumulated weight of fear and exhaustion and gratitude finally catching up to her. She had expected, when the gate closed behind her, that she would face this storm, and whatever came after, entirely alone. She had not expected kindness, certainly not from a stranger who owed her nothing, and stood to gain nothing from helping her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not know me. You have no reason to care what happens to a servant girl accused of theft." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "Perhaps," he said finally, "I have seen enough injustice in my life to recognize it clearly when it happens in front of me, and perhaps I have grown tired of standing by while it goes unchallenged." Elena did not fully understand the weight behind his words, could not have known the years of isolation and calculation that had shaped the man before her, the way his own reputation had been built on a foundation of guarded distance that kept the world from ever seeing what truly lay beneath his cold exterior. But she recognized sincerity when she heard it, and something in his answer settled a small measure of peace into her troubled heart. The afternoon passed quietly, both of them content to remain near the fire as the storm continued to weaken outside. Alaric shared what little food remained from the provisions he had gathered, and Elena found herself, despite everything, beginning to relax in his presence, the rigid wariness of the previous night slowly giving way to something closer to comfort. She did not know, as the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall softly outside the lodge windows, that the man sitting across from her carried a title that commanded fear throughout the region. She did not know that his careful investigation into her circumstances would soon uncover truths that would shake the Ashford household to its foundation. All she knew was that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel entirely alone in facing whatever challenges still lay ahead. As evening approached and the light outside began to fade, Alaric rose to add more wood to the fire, and Elena watched him with growing curiosity, wondering what other secrets he carried behind that steady, careful gaze. Whatever answers awaited her, she sensed instinctively, that this stranger would play no small part in helping her find them. 3 days passed before the roads became safe enough to travel, and in that time, the lodge became a strange sanctuary, suspended outside the ordinary flow of the world. Elena's strength returned steadily, with rest and food, and with it came a growing curiosity about the man who had pulled her from the storm, and now seemed determined to help her uncover the truth behind her banishment. On the morning they finally prepared to leave the lodge, Elena found herself watching Alaric saddle the horses with practiced efficiency, noting the fine craftsmanship of the leather and the quality of the horse itself, details that seemed at odds with a man who had first appeared to her as little more than a passing traveler. She said nothing of her observations, though the questions continued to gather in her mind. "Where will we go?" she asked, as he finished securing the saddle. "There is a small cottage not far from here," Alaric said. "It belongs to a tenant family who owes me a favor. You will be safe there while I make inquiries into the matter of the necklace. It is better that you remain out of sight until we understand more clearly what we are dealing with." Elena nodded, though a flicker of unease passed through her at the mention of inquiries and favors owed. The more time she spent with Alaric, the more she sensed layers to his identity that he had not yet revealed, and she found herself both curious and cautious about what those layers might contain. They rode together through the snow-covered countryside, the storm having finally passed, and left behind a world blanketed in pristine white. Elena sat before him on the horse, wrapped in the coat he had given her, watching the landscape pass in comfortable silence. Neither of them spoke much during the journey, but the silence between them felt easy rather than strained, a comfortable quiet built on the trust that had grown between them over the past 3 days. The cottage, when they reached it, was small but sturdy, tucked into a clearing surrounded by tall pines. Smoke already curled from its chimney, and as they approached, the door opened to reveal an older woman with kind eyes and flower-dusted hands, who greeted Alaric with familiar warmth despite the evident difference in their stations. "Your Grace," the woman said, and Elena felt her breath catch at the title, her eyes flying to Alaric's face in sudden alarm. Alaric's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though he recovered quickly, offering the woman a polite nod. "Mrs. Pruitt, this is Elena. She will be staying with you for a short time. I trust you will make her comfortable." Mrs. Pruitt, either not noticing or tactfully ignoring the sudden tension that had entered the conversation, nodded warmly and gestured for them both to come inside out of the cold. Elena followed, her mind racing, the word grace echoing in her thoughts with growing significance. Once inside, while Mrs. Pruitt busied herself preparing tea in the small kitchen, Elena turned to Alaric with a question burning on her lips, though she kept her voice low enough that it would not carry. "Your Grace," she repeated quietly. "She called you, Your Grace." Alaric's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena thought he might deny it, might offer some explanation that would smooth over the discrepancy. Instead, he simply held her gaze steadily, as if weighing how much truth she could handle in this moment. "There will be time to discuss that," he said carefully, "but not here, and not now. Please trust that my intentions toward you remain exactly as they have been since the night I found you." Elena studied his face, searching for the deception she had feared might be lurking beneath his kindness, but found instead only quiet sincerity, tempered by what looked like genuine reluctance to have this particular truth surface before he was ready to share it fully. Whatever title he carried, whatever position of power he held, his manner toward her had not changed since the moment she woke by the fire in the lodge. She decided, for now, to let the matter rest, though the question of his true identity settled into the back of her mind like a stone she could not quite set down. Mrs. Pruitt returned with tea and warm bread, and the conversation shifted to more practical matters, the arrangements for Elena's stay, the small tasks she might help with around the cottage to occupy her time and ease any sense of being merely a burden upon the household. Alaric remained only a short while longer before announcing his departure, explaining that he had matters requiring his attention but would return within a few days with news of his inquiries. Before he left, he drew Elena aside for a private word, his voice low enough that Mrs. Pruitt, occupied again in the kitchen, could not overhear. "I know you have questions," he said quietly, "and I promise you will have answers, in time. But the investigation into your circumstances requires discretion. If word reaches the Ashford household that inquiries are being made, whoever is responsible for your banishment may take steps to cover their tracks more thoroughly. I need you to trust me a little longer." Elena searched his face, weighing the sincerity in his words against the unsettling revelation of his hidden title. "I trust you," she said finally, surprising herself with how easily the words came. How true they felt, even amid her uncertainty. "But I would rather know the truth about who you are sooner than later." "You will," he promised. "I give you my word." With that, he departed, leaving Elena in the care of Mrs. Pruitt, whose warm and unassuming manner quickly put Elena at ease, despite the whirlwind of revelations from the morning. Over the following days, Elena settled into a quiet routine at the cottage, helping with small tasks, sharing meals with the kind older woman, and trying not to dwell too heavily on the mystery of Alaric's true identity, or the uncertain fate of her own future. Meanwhile, Alaric rode toward his own estate, with a mind full of calculations and plans. As Duke, he possessed resources and connections that few others in the region could match, and he intended to use every one of them to uncover the truth behind Elena's banishment. He sent quiet inquiries to contacts within the Ashford household's circle of acquaintances, careful never to reveal his personal interest in the matter, framing his questions instead as idle curiosity about the affairs of a family with whom he maintained polite but distant relations. Within 2 days, small pieces of information began to filter back to him. A merchant in the nearby town mentioned, in the course of an unrelated conversation, that Gareth Ashford had recently settled a substantial debt that had been troubling him for months, paying it off suddenly, and without explanation, shortly after Elena's banishment. Another contact, a jeweler who occasionally handled appraisals for wealthy families in the region, recalled that Gareth had inquired several weeks earlier about the value of certain silver pieces, framing the questions as though he were considering a purchase for a family member. Alaric gathered these threads carefully, recognizing the shape of a pattern beginning to emerge, though he knew he needed more concrete evidence before he could act. Accusations against a member of a prominent family required substantial proof, particularly when the accused held a position of relative respectability within the household. He could not simply present suspicions and expect the matter to be resolved in Elena's favor. He decided the most direct path forward would require a more careful examination of the Ashford household itself, conducted in a manner that would not immediately arouse suspicion. He sent word ahead requesting a private meeting with Lord Edmund Ashford, framing the request as related to a business matter concerning shared land boundaries between their two estates, a plausible enough reason that would grant him access to the household without revealing his true purpose. The meeting was arranged for the following week, giving Alaric time to gather additional information before confronting the family directly. In the meantime, he made arrangements to visit Elena at the cottage, eager to share what progress he had made, and equally, though he would not have readily admitted it even to himself, eager simply to see her again. When he arrived at the cottage several days later, he found Elena sitting near the window, mending a torn piece of clothing with careful stitches, her dark hair catching the afternoon light in a way that made something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. She looked up at the sound of his arrival, and the smile that crossed her face at seeing him settled something uneasy in his own heart that he had not realized was troubling him. "You have news," she said, setting aside her mending as he entered. "Some," he confirmed, taking the seat Mrs. Pruitt gestured toward before excusing herself to give them privacy. "Enough to suggest that your instincts about Gareth Ashford were well-founded, though I do not yet have proof sufficient to bring formal accusation against him." He shared what he had learned, the settled debt, the inquiries about silver valuations, watching Elena's expression shift from cautious hope to something closer to vindication as the pieces began to align with her own suspicions. "Then it truly was him," she said quietly. "He stole the necklace himself, and let me take the blame." "It appears increasingly likely," Alaric agreed, "though we will need more than circumstance to prove it conclusively. I have arranged a meeting with Lord Edmund next week, under the guise of discussing an unrelated business matter. It should provide an opportunity to observe the household more closely and perhaps gather further evidence." Elena's expression grew thoughtful, and after a moment she spoke again, her voice careful. "There is something else you should know. Before I was banished, I overheard a conversation between Gareth and one of the other servants, a young man named Nathaniel who works as a footman. I did not think much of it at the time, but now, considering everything, it seems worth mentioning." Alaric leaned forward with interest. "What did you hear?" Gareth asked Nathaniel to keep quiet about something. Elena said slowly, trying to recall the exact details of the exchange she had overlooked in the chaos of her own troubles. He mentioned needing Nathaniel's discretion regarding a matter involving the household ledgers. I assumed at the time it related to some minor household business, but now I wonder if it might connect to his financial difficulties. This detail added another thread to the pattern forming in Alaric's mind. If Gareth had been manipulating household finances alongside stealing the necklace, the scope of his deception might extend far beyond a single act of theft blamed unfairly on an innocent servant. It suggested a pattern of behavior that could prove far more damaging to Gareth's position once fully exposed. "This footman, Nathaniel," Alaric said. "Do you believe he might be willing to speak honestly about what he knows, if approached carefully?" Elena considered this. "I do not know him well, but he never struck me as unkind, merely cautious about his own position, as any servant must be. If approached in a way that does not threaten his own security, he might be willing to share what he knows." "Then that will be my next step," Alaric said, already turning the possibilities over in his mind. A quiet conversation with young Nathaniel, conducted in a manner that assures him his own position will not be jeopardized by honesty. They continued discussing the details of the investigation for the remainder of the afternoon, and Elena found herself increasingly impressed by the careful, methodical way Alaric approached the problem, gathering evidence patiently, rather than rushing toward confrontation before the case against Gareth had been fully established. It was a quality she had not expected from a man whose title alone, she now understood, commanded fear throughout the region. As the light outside began to fade, and Alaric prepared to depart once more, Elena found herself reluctant to see him go, an unexpected warmth having grown between them over the course of their shared investigation. She did not fully understand the feeling, only recognized that his presence had become, in the short time she had known him, a source of comfort and stability amid the uncertainty of her circumstances. "Thank you," she said as he prepared to leave, "for everything you have done. I do not know how I will ever repay such kindness." Alaric paused at the door, studying her for a long moment, before responding. "There is no debt between us," he said quietly. "What I do because it is right, and because you deserve far better than what was done to you. That is reward enough." With that, he departed once more, leaving Elena to sit with her thoughts as evening settled over the small cottage. She returned to her mending, though her mind remained occupied with thoughts of Gareth's deception, the mystery of Alaric's true title, and the strange, unexpected warmth that had begun to take root in her heart despite everything that had happened. The path toward justice remained uncertain, but for the first time since the gate had slammed shut behind her, Elena felt genuine hope that the truth would eventually come to light. Nathaniel the footman nearly dropped the tray of silverware he was carrying when a stranger approached him in the stable yard behind the Ashford estate, a tall man in plain traveling clothes, who introduced himself only as someone interested in a private conversation regarding recent events within the household. Nathaniel's first instinct was suspicion, his hands tightening around the tray as he glanced nervously toward the manor windows, worried that someone might observe the exchange and question him about it later. "I mean you no harm," Alaric said calmly, keeping his voice low and his manner unthreatening. "I only wish to ask a few questions about the young woman who was recently dismissed from service here, Elena." Nathaniel's expression shifted at the mention of her name, something like guilt flickering across his features before he composed himself. "I do not know anything about that matter, beyond what everyone else witnessed," he said carefully. "She was accused of theft and dismissed accordingly." "I understand," Alaric said patiently, "but I have reason to believe the circumstances surrounding that accusation may not be entirely as they appeared. I am told you may have information relevant to understanding what truly happened." Nathaniel's discomfort grew visible, his eyes darting again toward the manor, before settling back on Alaric with evident wariness. "I could lose my position for speaking out of turn about the family's private affairs," he said quietly. "I have a mother who depends on my wages. I cannot risk that for questions from a stranger I do not know." Alaric considered this carefully, recognizing the legitimate fear behind the young man's reluctance. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small pouch, setting it on a nearby post without making a show of the gesture. "I understand your position," he said. "Whatever you choose to share or not share, this is yours, regardless, simply for your time. But I promise you this, if the truth you know helps correct an injustice done to an innocent woman. I will ensure your own position remains secure, whatever the consequences for others involved." Nathaniel eyed the pouch for a long moment, before finally setting down his tray and stepping closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There was a conversation," he admitted, "between myself and Master Gareth, several weeks before the incident with the necklace. He asked me to keep certain household ledgers away from Lord Edmund's regular review, claiming he needed additional time to reconcile some figures related to expenses he had incurred managing family business. "And did you comply with this request?" Alaric asked. Nathaniel nodded reluctantly. "I did not think much of it at the time. Master Gareth often handled matters related to household accounts, and it seemed a reasonable enough request from a member of the family. But after Elena was accused and dismissed, I began to wonder if there might be some connection between his request and the missing necklace." "What kind of connection do you suspect?" Alaric pressed gently. Nathaniel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of what he was about to suggest. "I wondered if perhaps Master Gareth had been taking money from the household accounts, small amounts here and there, difficult to notice unless someone examined the ledgers carefully. If he needed to cover a larger debt suddenly, perhaps selling the necklace provided funds he could not otherwise easily access without drawing attention." This aligned precisely with the pattern Alaric had already begun to suspect, adding further weight to the case building against Gareth. "Would you be willing to state what you have told me to Lord Edmund directly, if the situation required it?" Nathaniel's face paled slightly at the suggestion, but after a long moment of consideration, he nodded slowly. "If it means clearing an innocent woman's name, and if you can truly ensure my position remains secure, then yes, I will speak the truth." Alaric thanked him sincerely, promising to be in touch as the investigation progressed, and departed the stable yard with a growing sense of confidence that the pieces of evidence against Gareth were beginning to form a picture too clear to easily dismiss. He needed only a few more threads to weave together a case substantial enough to present formally before Lord Edmund. His next step led him to the jeweler in town who had mentioned Gareth's earlier inquiries about silver valuations. Alaric visited the small shop personally, engaging the elderly craftsman in careful conversation that gradually led toward the specific details he required. "Master Gareth Ashford visited your shop some weeks ago," Alaric said, after the initial pleasantries had established a comfortable rapport. "Regarding silver pieces, I understand." The jeweler nodded, wiping his hands on his apron as he considered the question. "That is correct, Your Grace. He inquired about the value of a particular type of necklace, silver with a distinctive pattern of engraving. I recall the details clearly, because it is not a common style, and he seemed quite specific in his description." "Did he indicate why he wished to know this information?" Alaric asked. "He claimed he was considering purchasing a similar piece as a gift," the jeweler said. "Though I confess, something about his manner struck me as odd at the time. He seemed more interested in understanding how quickly such a piece might be sold, rather than simply its value for purchase." This detail proved invaluable, suggesting that Gareth had been planning to sell the necklace even before the theft occurred, likely testing the waters to understand how quickly he might convert the stolen item into the funds he needed. Alaric thanked the jeweler for his candor, and departed the shop with yet another piece of evidence to add to his growing case. Over the following days, Alaric continued his careful investigation, speaking discreetly with several other members of the Ashford household staff, each conversation yielding small additional details that further solidified the picture of Gareth's deception. A kitchen maid, named Lucy, recalled seeing Gareth near the servants' quarters on the evening the necklace disappeared, at an hour when he had no reasonable business being in that part of the house. A stable boy named Oliver mentioned that Gareth had ridden into town alone on several occasions in recent weeks, without his usual companions or explanation for his errands. Each piece, taken alone, might have been dismissed as coincidence or innocent circumstance, but together, they formed a pattern too consistent and too specific to easily explain away. Alaric began compiling his findings carefully, organizing the evidence in a manner that would present a clear and compelling case when the time came to confront the matter directly. Throughout this period, he made regular visits to the cottage where Elena remained under Mrs. Pruitt's care, sharing updates on his progress, and finding, with each visit, that his eagerness to see her grew rather than diminished. He told himself these visits were purely practical, necessary to keep her informed, and to gather any additional details her memory might yield. But he knew, in the quiet honesty he allowed himself only in his most private thoughts, that his motivations had grown considerably more complicated than simple practicality. During one such visit, as they sat together near the cottage fire discussing the details of Nathaniel's testimony, Elena turned to him with a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "You still have not told me your true title," she said quietly. "Mrs. Pruitt calls you Your Grace, which suggests something far beyond what I initially assumed about your circumstances. I would rather hear the truth from you directly than continue guessing." Alaric set down the papers he had been reviewing and met her gaze steadily, recognizing that the moment for honesty could no longer reasonably be postponed. "I am the Duke of Thornfield," he said finally, watching her expression carefully for any sign of the fear or distance he had encountered so often from others upon learning of his position. "I hold considerable land and influence throughout this region, and I confess that reputation has painted me, in the minds of many, as a man to be feared rather than trusted." Elena absorbed this information quietly, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed, which surprised him somewhat, given the reactions he had grown accustomed to over the years. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" she asked, though her tone carried curiosity rather than accusation. "Because I wished to know how you would treat me, without the weight of that title influencing your perception," he admitted, the confession costing him something to voice aloud. "I have grown weary, over the years, of people who treat me according to my position, rather than according to who I actually am. When I found you in the snow, and later, as we spoke and I came to understand your character, I found myself reluctant to introduce that complication into what had begun as something simpler and, I confess, more meaningful to me than I anticipated." Elena studied him for a long moment, processing this admission with evident care. "Then you feared I would treat you differently, as so many others must," she said slowly. "Feared, perhaps, rather than trusted, simply because of a title, rather than because of anything you had actually done." "Yes," Alaric admitted simply. "I cannot promise how I might have reacted, had you told me from the very beginning," Elena said honestly. "Fear is a powerful thing, and your reputation, as you say, precedes you throughout this region. But having come to know you these past days, having witnessed your patience, and your genuine concern for uncovering the truth on my behalf, I find that the title changes very little about how I already feel toward you." Alaric felt something ease in his chest at her words, a tension he had carried for years finally loosening in the presence of someone who saw him clearly, without the distorting lens of fear or ambition that colored so many other relationships in his life. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for extending me that grace." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the weight of his revealed identity settling gently between them, rather than creating the distance he had feared. When he finally rose to depart that evening, Elena walked him to the door, and for a moment, standing close together in the fading light, something passed between them that neither of them fully acknowledged aloud, though both felt its quiet significance. "Be careful," Elena said softly. "Whatever Gareth has done, he will not welcome an investigation that threatens to expose him. If he suspects what you are doing, he may take drastic measures to protect himself." "I will be careful," Alaric promised. "And soon, I hope, we will have gathered enough evidence to bring this matter to a proper resolution, one that restores your good name and holds Gareth accountable for his deception." With that, he departed into the cold evening air, leaving Elena to watch him go, with a heart that had grown considerably more entangled with his fate than she might have expected only days before. The investigation was progressing well, the truth slowly emerging from the shadows where Gareth had hidden it. But as Elena returned to the warmth of the cottage, she could not shake a lingering unease, a sense that the path toward justice, however promising it appeared, might yet hold challenges neither of them had fully anticipated. The meeting with Lord Edmund Ashford had been arranged for mid-morning, and Alaric arrived at the estate with a portfolio of carefully organized evidence tucked beneath his arm, though he intended to proceed cautiously, testing the waters, before revealing the full scope of what he had uncovered. A direct accusation, presented too abruptly, risked provoking defensive denial rather than honest reckoning, and Alaric understood that Lord Edmund's cooperation would prove essential to resolving the matter properly. He was received in the main study, a room lined with heavy shelves of leather-bound books and warmed by a substantial fire. Lord Edmund greeted him with the polite formality expected between men of their respective standings, though Alaric noted the slight nervousness beneath the older man's composed exterior, a tension that suggested Lord Edmund harbored some awareness, even if only subconscious, that matters within his household were not entirely as they appeared. "Your Grace," Lord Edmund said, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. "I confess, I was surprised to receive your request for a meeting. Our estates share boundaries, of course, but we have had little occasion for direct discourse in recent years." "I appreciate your willingness to receive me on short notice," Alaric replied, settling into the offered chair while keeping his portfolio close at hand. "The matter I wish to discuss does relate, in part, to boundary considerations. But I confess, there is a more pressing concern I hope we might address as well." Lord Edmund's expression grew slightly wary, though he maintained his composed demeanor. "Of course. Please, speak freely." Alaric considered his approach carefully before continuing. "I understand your household recently dismissed a servant, a young woman named Elena, on charges of theft. I have reason to believe the circumstances surrounding that dismissal warrant further examination." The color drained slightly from Lord Edmund's face, though whether from surprise or from some deeper unease, Alaric could not immediately discern. "That matter was settled some time ago," Lord Edmund said carefully. "The necklace was found among her belongings. There seemed little room for doubt regarding her guilt. And yet," Alaric said gently, "evidence has come to my attention, suggesting that the true circumstances may differ considerably from what was initially assumed." He proceeded to lay out the case he had assembled, carefully and methodically, presenting each piece of evidence in turn. He described Nathaniel's account of Gareth's request to conceal certain household ledgers, the jeweler's recollection of Gareth's peculiar inquiries about the necklace's resale value, the various sightings of Gareth engaging in behavior inconsistent with innocent circumstance, the timing of his sudden debt settlement following closely on the heels of Elena's dismissal. Lord Edmund listened with growing distress, his composed exterior gradually crumbling as the weight of the evidence settled over him. When Alaric finished, the older man sat in stunned silence for several long moments, processing the implications of what he had just heard. "You are suggesting," Lord Edmund said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "that my own cousin orchestrated this deception, allowing an innocent servant to bear the consequences of his own theft." "I believe the evidence points strongly in that direction," Alaric confirmed, "though I recognize this is a difficult truth to accept regarding a member of your own family." Lord Edmund rose from his chair and paced toward the window, his hands clasped tightly behind his back as he stared out at the snow-covered grounds beyond. "Gareth came to me some months ago," he said slowly, as if working through the memory carefully, explaining that he had encountered financial difficulties through no fault of his own, misfortune in some business dealings, he claimed. "I offered him hospitality here, while he sorted through his affairs, believing I was extending kindness to family in a moment of need." "It appears that kindness may have been exploited," Alaric said carefully. Lord Edmund turned back from the window, his expression hardening with a resolve that suggested the initial shock was giving way to something closer to anger. "If what you say is true, then I owe that young woman a debt I can hardly begin to repay. She was cast out into a storm that very nearly cost her life, based on a lie constructed to protect someone I trusted and welcomed into my home. There is still the matter of confirming this evidence beyond doubt," Alaric said. "I would suggest a careful examination of the household ledgers Gareth requested be concealed, along with a direct conversation with Nathaniel to formalize his testimony. If the evidence holds, as I believe it will, we can proceed toward a resolution that both restores Elena's good name and holds Gareth accountable for his actions." Lord Edmund agreed readily to this course of action, his earlier reluctance to doubt his own family member giving way entirely to a determination to see justice properly served. He summoned Nathaniel immediately, and the young footman, though visibly nervous, repeated his account with a steadiness that lent considerable weight to his testimony. Lord Edmund then called for the household ledgers to be brought forward, and together with Alaric, he began the careful work of examining the financial records for any irregularities. The examination revealed exactly what Alaric had suspected. Small discrepancies scattered throughout several months of records, amounts that individually might have escaped notice but that, when totaled together, represented a considerable sum quietly diverted from household accounts. The pattern aligned precisely with the timeline of Gareth's residence at the estate, beginning shortly after his arrival and continuing steadily until the necklace's disappearance provided him with a final, larger sum to settle his outstanding debts. "This is damning indeed," Lord Edmund said grimly, setting down the ledger he had been reviewing. "I confess I feel a fool for not noticing these discrepancies sooner, though I trusted Gareth's management of these accounts without sufficient scrutiny." "Trust is not foolishness," Alaric said. "It is simply something that can be exploited by those willing to deceive those who extend it. The fault here lies with Gareth's choices, not with your willingness to extend hospitality to family." Lord Edmund nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. "What do you propose we do with this evidence now that we have confirmed it?" Alaric considered the question carefully before responding. "I believe the matter should be addressed directly and publicly within the household, ensuring that Elena's innocence is restored beyond any doubt, and that the true circumstances of the theft are understood by all who witnessed her banishment. Gareth should be given opportunity to respond to the evidence, though given its weight, I suspect he will find little room to maintain his deception." "And Elena herself?" Lord Edmund asked. "Where is she now? I would wish to offer her a proper apology, and whatever restitution might be appropriate given the circumstances of her mistreatment." "She is safe," Alaric said, choosing his words carefully to avoid revealing more of his personal involvement than necessary at this stage. "I will arrange for her return once matters here are settled, so that she might witness her name properly cleared before the household that wronged her." Lord Edmund agreed to this plan, and together they began making arrangements for a formal confrontation with Gareth, to take place within the coming days, once all necessary evidence had been thoroughly documented and prepared for presentation. Lady Margaret would need to be informed as well, a prospect that Lord Edmund approached with visible reluctance, given her strong initial conviction regarding Elena's guilt and the embarrassment she would surely feel upon learning how thoroughly she had been deceived. As Alaric prepared to depart the estate that afternoon, satisfied with the progress made, but mindful of the delicate proceedings still ahead, Lord Edmund walked him to the door personally, his expression thoughtful. "Your Grace," he said, pausing before Alaric could mount his waiting horse, "I must ask, why have you taken such personal interest in this matter? It is not, I think, common for a man of your standing to concern himself so deeply with the affairs of a household servant." Alaric considered his answer carefully, recognizing that the full truth of his growing feelings for Elena remained something he had not yet fully articulated even to himself, let alone to others. "I witnessed an injustice," he said finally, "and found myself unable to simply ride past it. Perhaps that is reason enough." Lord Edmund studied him for a long moment, something knowing entering his expression, though he chose not to press further. "Whatever your reasons, Your Grace, you have done this household and that young woman a considerable service. I am grateful for your involvement, however unusual its circumstances." Alaric departed shortly after, riding back toward the cottage where Elena waited, his mind already turning toward how best to share this significant progress with her, and toward the confrontation with Gareth that would soon determine the final resolution of this matter that had brought them together under such unlikely and dramatic circumstances. The evidence was strong, the case against Gareth nearly complete, but Alaric knew, as he rode through the winter landscape, that the most difficult conversations still lay ahead, both regarding the formal resolution of Elena's case and, perhaps more daunting still, regarding the feelings that had grown steadily between them since that fateful night in the storm. When Alaric returned to the cottage that evening, he found Elena helping Mrs. Pruitt prepare the evening meal, her sleeves rolled up and flour dusting her hands in a way that made her look, in that quiet domestic moment, entirely at ease, despite the uncertainty still hanging over her future. She looked up at the sound of his arrival, and the warmth in her smile settled something in his chest that had grown accustomed to expecting distance rather than genuine welcome from those around him. "You have news," she said, wiping her hands on her apron as she crossed toward him. "Good news, I believe," Alaric confirmed, and he shared the details of his meeting with Lord Edmund, the discovery of the discrepancies in the household ledgers, Nathaniel's formal testimony, and the plans now underway to confront Gareth with the full weight of the evidence against him. Elena listened with growing relief, the tension she had carried for days finally beginning to ease as the pieces of her vindication fell into place. "Then, it is nearly over," she said softly. "The truth will finally be known." "Nearly," Alaric confirmed. Lord Edmund intends to arrange a formal confrontation within the household, once the final preparations are complete. He wishes for you to be present, so that your name might be cleared publicly before those who witnessed your banishment. Elena felt a flicker of apprehension at the thought of returning to the estate that had cast her out so cruelly, though the prospect of seeing her name restored provided sufficient motivation to overcome her hesitation. "I will be there," she said firmly. "Whatever discomfort it brings, I want to see this resolved properly." Mrs. Pruitt, who had been listening quietly from the kitchen, insisted that Alaric stay for the evening meal, and he accepted the invitation gladly, finding himself increasingly reluctant to depart from the simple warmth of the cottage and the company of the two women who had, in a remarkably short time, come to feel like something approaching family. Over dinner, conversation flowed easily, Mrs. Pruitt sharing stories from her years managing the cottage and the surrounding lands, Elena gradually relaxing into gentle laughter at the older woman's dry humor, and Alaric finding himself, for perhaps the first time in years, genuinely enjoying the simple pleasure of shared company, without the weight of his title influencing every interaction. After the meal, as Mrs. Pruitt retired to her own quarters and left the two of them alone near the fire, Elena turned to Alaric with a question that had clearly been forming in her mind throughout the evening. "What will happen to Gareth?" she asked, "once his deception is confirmed before the household?" Alaric considered the question carefully. "That will depend somewhat on Lord Edmund's judgment, though given the severity of the deception, both the theft itself and the deliberate framing of an innocent servant, I suspect Gareth will face considerable consequences. At minimum, he will be removed from the household and stripped of any remaining trust or position within the family's affairs. Depending on Lord Edmund's inclination, formal charges may also be pursued." "And Lady Margaret?" Elena asked. "She was so quick to believe the worst of me, so certain of my guilt without any real consideration of the circumstances. Will she face any consequence for her hastiness?" Alaric's expression grew thoughtful. "That is a more delicate matter. Lady Margaret acted on evidence that appeared, at the time, compelling and straightforward. Her error lay perhaps in her unwillingness to consider alternative explanations, but the deception itself was constructed skillfully enough that many might have been fooled in her position. I suspect she will feel considerable embarrassment once the truth comes to light, which may prove its own form of consequence." Elena considered this, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she harbored less anger toward Lady Margaret than she might have expected. The woman's error, however painful its consequences for Elena personally, had grown from a genuine belief in the evidence presented, rather than from any particular malice toward Elena specifically. Gareth's calculated deception bore the true weight of blame for what had transpired. "I find I do not wish for elaborate punishment," Elena said slowly, working through her feelings as she spoke. "I only wish for the truth to be known, for my name to be cleared, and for those who witnessed my banishment to understand that I never deserved such treatment. Beyond that, I find I have little appetite for vengeance." Alaric studied her with an expression that held something close to admiration.
"That speaks well of your character,"
he said quietly. "Many in your position, having suffered such injustice, would seek far harsher retribution than simple restoration of their good name." "Perhaps," Elena said, "but I have learned, these past days, that dwelling on anger accomplishes little beyond consuming the peace that might otherwise be found in resolution. I would rather move forward with my life than remain trapped by resentment toward those who wronged me." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the fire crackling gently as the evening deepened around them. Alaric found himself studying Elena's profile in the firelight, noting the quiet strength that had carried her through everything she had endured, the resilience that had allowed her to maintain her dignity, and her essential kindness, even after suffering such profound betrayal at the hands of those she had served faithfully for years. "May I ask you something personal?" he said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. Elena turned to look at him, curiosity evident in her expression. "Of course." "What will you do?" he asked carefully. "Once this matter is resolved and your name is properly cleared, will you seek another position in service, or do you have other plans for your future?" Elena considered this question thoughtfully, recognizing that she had not allowed herself to think too far beyond the immediate resolution of her current circumstances. "I do not know," she admitted honestly. "I suppose I had assumed I would seek another household requiring servants." though I confess the prospect holds less appeal now than it once might have. These past days, staying here with Mrs. Pruitt, working alongside her, rather than beneath the constant scrutiny of a demanding mistress, I have come to appreciate a different kind of life than the one I knew before. What kind of life would you choose, if the choice were entirely yours to make? Alaric asked, his voice carrying a curiosity that felt, to Elena, more personal than the question itself might have suggested. Elena hesitated, considering the question, with genuine care before answering. I think I would wish for something simpler than what I knew at the Ashford estate. A quiet life, perhaps, with people who value honesty and kindness rather than status and appearance. I do not require wealth or grand circumstance, only a place where I might feel genuinely valued for who I am, rather than merely tolerated for the labor I provide. Alaric felt something shift within him as she spoke, a recognition of shared longing that he had not expected to find so clearly articulated in someone else's words. He, too, had spent years surrounded by people who valued his title and his wealth far more than they valued him personally, courtiers and distant relations who sought his favor for their own advancement rather than genuine connection. Elena's simple, honest desire for a life built on authentic relationship rather than status resonated with something he had long suppressed within himself. I understand that longing better than you might expect, he said quietly. My own position has often felt more like a barrier than a blessing, separating me from genuine connection with those around me. Most people who seek my company do so because of what I might offer them, whether protection, influence, or wealth, rather than because they value my presence for its own sake. Elena studied him with growing understanding, recognizing in his words an echo of the isolation she had sensed beneath his careful, guarded manner since the very first night they met. Is that why you concealed your title from me at first? She asked gently. Because you wished to know whether I might value you for who you are, rather than for what you possess? Yes, Alaric admitted, the confession feeling both vulnerable and freeing to voice aloud. And I confess, these past days spent in your company have proven more meaningful to me than I anticipated when I first followed your tracks through that storm. Elena felt her heart quicken at his words, recognizing the sincerity behind them, and finding, to her own surprise, that similar feelings had been growing within her own heart throughout their time together. I have valued your company as well, she said softly, far beyond simple gratitude for the rescue you provided. There is something in your manner, your patience, your genuine care for uncovering truth and justice that I have come to admire considerably. They sat together in the firelight, the unspoken understanding between them growing clearer with each word exchanged, though neither yet ventured to name explicitly the feelings that had taken root during their shared ordeal. The evening deepened around them, and eventually Alaric rose to depart, aware that propriety required he not linger too long into the night, however reluctant he felt to leave her company. I will return once the confrontation with Gareth has been arranged, he said, pausing at the door. It should take place within the next few days, once Lord Edmund has completed his final preparations. Elena nodded, walking with him to the door despite the cold night air waiting beyond. I will be ready, she said. Whatever comes, I am grateful to face it, knowing you stand beside me in seeking the truth. Alaric held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, before he finally turned to depart into the winter night, leaving Elena to watch him go with a heart considerably more entangled in his fate than she might have anticipated only a week before, when she had known him only as a mysterious stranger who had pulled her from a deadly storm. Word travels quickly within a household, even when great care is taken to keep matters discreet, and it was only 2 days after Alaric's meeting with Lord Edmund that whispers began reaching Gareth Ashford regarding the sudden interest being taken in the household ledgers. A kitchen maid, unaware of the sensitivity of the matter, had mentioned in passing conversation that Lord Edmund and a visiting duke had spent considerable time reviewing financial records, and that Nathaniel had been summoned for a private conversation shortly afterward. Gareth received this information with a calm exterior that masked a rapidly growing unease. He had believed, in the weeks since Elena's dismissal, that the matter had been settled definitively, the necklace theft resolved and forgotten, his own financial troubles quietly addressed through the funds he had gained from selling the stolen piece. The sudden mention of ledger reviews and private conversations with the footman suggested that his careful deception had begun to unravel in ways he had not anticipated. He spent that evening in his private quarters, pacing before the fire as he considered his options. If Nathaniel had spoken of their earlier conversation regarding the concealed ledgers, and if the examination of household accounts had revealed the discrepancies he had worked carefully to disguise, then his position within the household stood in genuine jeopardy. He needed to act quickly, before suspicion solidified into confirmed accusation. His first thought turned toward Nathaniel, recognizing that the young footman represented the most immediate threat to his continued deception. If Nathaniel could be persuaded to recant whatever he had shared, or frightened into silence regarding future testimony, Gareth might yet salvage his position within the household. He resolved to seek out the footman the following morning, before matters progressed any further toward formal confrontation. Nathaniel, for his part, had grown increasingly anxious since his conversation with Alaric, aware that his testimony, once formally presented, would place him in direct opposition to a member of the family he served. When Gareth approached him the following morning in a quiet corner of the servants' hall, ostensibly to discuss unrelated household matters, Nathaniel felt his stomach tighten with dread, sensing immediately the true purpose behind the seemingly casual conversation. "I understand there has been considerable interest in the household accounts recently," Gareth said, his tone carefully light, though his eyes carried a sharpness that belied the casual manner of his speech. "I wonder if you might have shared some observations regarding our earlier conversation about the ledgers." Nathaniel's throat went dry, though he forced himself to maintain a steady composure. "I answered honestly when questioned," he said carefully. "I could not, in good conscience, withhold information relevant to clearing an innocent woman's name." Gareth's expression flickered with something dangerous, quickly suppressed beneath a mask of calm reasonableness. "You must understand," he said, his voice dropping lower, "that whatever you believe you observed carries significant weight for my reputation and standing within this family. I would hope you might reconsider the accuracy of certain details, particularly if your continued position here depends upon maintaining amicable relations with those who employ you." The implicit threat hung in the air between them, and Nathaniel felt fear tighten around his chest at the clear suggestion that his livelihood might depend on retracting his honest testimony. He remembered Alaric's promise to ensure his position remained secure, and he clung to that assurance as he formulated his response. "I have spoken only the truth," Nathaniel said, his voice steadier than he felt internally. "I cannot in conscience say otherwise, regardless of any consequence to myself." Gareth's composed exterior cracked slightly at this refusal, a flash of genuine anger passing across his features before he recovered his careful mask. "Consider carefully what you are risking," he said quietly, before turning and departing without further discussion, leaving Nathaniel shaken, but resolved in his commitment to honesty. Nathaniel wasted no time reporting this exchange to Lord Edmund, recognizing that Gareth's attempt at intimidation represented further confirmation of his guilty conscience and his desperate need to suppress the truth before it could be formally established. Lord Edmund, already troubled by the mounting evidence against his cousin, received this news with grim resolve. "This confirms what we already suspected," he told Nathaniel firmly. "Your continued honesty is appreciated, and I assure you that your position within this household remains entirely secure, regardless of whatever pressure Gareth might attempt to apply." Word of this attempted intimidation reached Alaric later that same day. Carried by a swift messenger, Lord Edmund dispatched to inform him of this concerning development. Alaric received the news with sharpened concern, recognizing that Gareth's awareness of the investigation, combined with his willingness to threaten witnesses, suggested a man growing desperate and potentially unpredictable in his efforts to protect himself from exposure. He rode immediately to the cottage, where Elena remained under Mrs. Pruitt's care, arriving with an urgency that immediately alerted Elena to the seriousness of whatever news he carried. "What has happened?" she asked, her earlier calm giving way to concern, as she noted the tension evident in his expression. Alaric explained the situation quickly, describing Gareth's attempt to intimidate Nathaniel and the growing evidence that he had become aware of the investigation closing in around him. "I believe we must act more swiftly than originally planned," he said. "A man cornered and desperate may take rash action to protect himself, and I would rather resolve this matter definitively before Gareth has opportunity to cause further harm, whether to Nathaniel, to the evidence itself, or potentially to his own circumstances, through some desperate attempt at flight." Elena felt a chill of apprehension at this suggestion, recognizing the genuine danger that Gareth's growing desperation might pose. "What do you propose?" she asked. "I believe we should proceed with the formal confrontation immediately, rather than waiting further," Alaric said. "Lord Edmund has already gathered sufficient evidence, and further delay only provides Gareth additional opportunity to attempt further intimidation, or, worse, to flee, before he can be held accountable for his actions." Elena nodded slowly, steeling herself for what lay ahead. "Then I am ready to face him, whenever the confrontation is arranged. I have waited long enough for the truth to be known, and I would rather see this matter resolved swiftly than allow him further opportunity to cause harm to others who have shown me kindness in coming forward with the truth." Alaric studied her carefully, noting the resolve in her expression, despite the evident apprehension that remained beneath her composed exterior. "You do not need to face him if you would rather remain here while the matter is settled," he said gently. "I would understand entirely if you preferred to avoid direct confrontation with the man responsible for your suffering." "No," Elena said firmly, shaking her head. "I want to be there. I want him to see, when the truth is finally revealed, that his deception did not succeed in destroying me, as he perhaps intended. I want Lord Edmund and Lady Margaret and everyone else who witnessed my banishment to see that I stand vindicated, and that I face this ordeal with dignity rather than despair." Alaric felt a surge of admiration at her courage, recognizing in her resolve the same quiet strength that had first drawn his attention on that fateful night in the storm. "Then we shall proceed together," he said. "I will send word to Lord Edmund that we are prepared to move forward with the confrontation as soon as arrangements can be made." That evening, as preparations began in earnest for the difficult confrontation that awaited them, Elena found herself unable to fully settle her nerves, despite Alaric's reassuring presence. She understood the necessity of facing Gareth directly, understood that only through public exposure of his deception could her name be truly and fully restored. But the prospect of returning to the estate that had cast her out so cruelly, of standing once more before Lady Margaret's judgment, however different the circumstances now stood, filled her with an anxiety she could not entirely suppress. Alaric, sensing her unease, remained at the cottage later than usual that evening, offering what quiet comfort he could through simple presence and steady reassurance. "You will not face this alone," he told her as the evening deepened around them. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I will stand beside you throughout, and Lord Edmund has already committed himself to ensuring justice is properly served." "I know," Elena said softly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the anxiety she still carried. "I only wish this could be resolved without further confrontation, without having to face them all again, after everything that happened." "I understand that wish," Alaric said gently, "but sometimes, the only path to true resolution requires facing our fears directly, rather than allowing them to remain unresolved shadows haunting our future peace. Tomorrow, you will not merely survive this confrontation. You will emerge from it vindicated, your name restored, and the truth finally known to all who doubted you." His words offered some measure of comfort, and Elena found herself grateful, not for the first time, for the steady strength he provided during this most difficult chapter of her life. As he finally prepared to depart for the night, promising to return early the following morning to accompany her to the estate, Elena felt a fragile but genuine hope settling over her anxiety, a belief that whatever challenges tomorrow held, she would face them with an ally whose support had proven, time and again, more steadfast than she could have imagined possible only days before. The morning of the confrontation arrived cold and clear, the storm that had once threatened Elena's life, now nothing more than a distant memory beneath skies swept clean of clouds. Alaric arrived at the cottage just as the sun crested the horizon, and Elena, dressed in a modest but dignified gown that Mrs. Pruitt had helped her prepare the night before, met him at the door with an expression of steady resolve that belied the nervousness still churning beneath her calm exterior. "Are you ready?" Alaric asked gently, offering his arm as they walked toward the waiting horses. "As ready as I believe I can be," Elena replied. "Whatever happens today, I intend to face it with my head held high. I have done nothing wrong, and I will not allow fear to diminish that truth." They rode together toward the Ashford estate, the journey passing in a silence charged with anticipation, rather than the comfortable quiet that had characterized their earlier travels together. As the familiar gates of the estate came into view, Elena felt her chest tighten with the memory of that terrible night, when those same gates had closed behind her. casting her out into a storm that had very nearly claimed her life. But this time, rather than being turned away, they were received with quiet formality by a footman who escorted them directly to the main hall, where Lord Edmund awaited their arrival. The hall had been arranged for the confrontation, with several members of the household staff gathered along the periphery, summoned by Lord Edmund to witness the proceedings that would finally resolve the matter of Elena's dismissal. Lady Margaret stood near her husband, her expression carrying a mixture of confusion and barely suppressed anxiety, having been informed only that morning of the serious concerns that had emerged regarding Gareth's conduct and the true circumstances of the necklace's disappearance. Gareth himself stood near the fireplace, his posture rigid with tension, his eyes darting toward the door as Alaric and Elena entered. Whatever composure he had maintained in the days since Nathaniel's refusal to recant his testimony had clearly begun to crack under the weight of mounting evidence, and the realization that his careful deception was unraveling beyond his ability to control. "Your Grace," Lord Edmund said formally, acknowledging Alaric's arrival before his gaze shifted to Elena, his expression softening with genuine remorse. "Elena, I owe you a considerable apology for the treatment you received in this household. Treatment that I now understand was based on a deception far more calculated and cruel than any of us initially recognized." Elena inclined her head slightly, her voice steady, despite the emotion churning beneath her composed exterior. "Thank you, Lord Edmund. I appreciate your willingness to seek the truth, even when it meant confronting difficult realities within your own family." Lady Margaret stepped forward, her expression carrying visible distress. "I do not understand," she said, her voice tight with confusion and mounting alarm. "The necklace was found among her belongings. What deception could possibly explain such clear evidence?" Lord Edmund turned to address his wife directly, his tone carrying a gravity that immediately silenced any further protest. "The evidence gathered these past days suggests strongly that Gareth himself stole the necklace, selling it to settle debts he had accumulated, and then planted it among Elena's belongings to deflect suspicion away from himself." The color drained from Lady Margaret's face as the implications of this statement settled over her, her gaze shifting toward Gareth with dawning horror. "Gareth," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "tell me this is not true." Gareth's composed mask finally shattered entirely under the weight of the accumulated evidence and the direct scrutiny now focused upon him. "This is absurd," he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the panic building beneath his words. "I have done nothing wrong. This is nothing more than baseless speculation dressed up as fact." "Is that so?" Alaric said calmly, stepping forward with the portfolio of evidence he had carried into the hall. "Perhaps you would care to explain, then, why the household ledgers show a pattern of small discrepancies, coinciding precisely with your residence here. Discrepancies that ceased entirely once you settled a substantial debt shortly after the necklace disappeared." Gareth's eyes widened slightly, though he attempted to maintain his denial. "Coincidence proves nothing. Any number of explanations might account for such discrepancies." "Perhaps," Alaric continued, unmoved by the protest. "But perhaps you would also care to explain your visit to the jeweler in town, some weeks before the theft, where you inquired specifically about the value and resale potential of a silver necklace matching the exact description of the piece that later disappeared from this household." Gareth's face paled further, his composure cracking visibly now, as the weight of the specific evidence closed in around him. "I do not recall any such visit," he said, though his voice carried far less conviction than before. "The jeweler recalls it quite clearly," Alaric said. "And Nathaniel recalls quite clearly as well your request that he conceal certain household ledgers from Lord Edmund's regular review, a request made shortly before the theft occurred, and the timing of which suggests considerable premeditation on your part." At this final piece of evidence, Gareth's resolve finally broke entirely. He glanced around the hall, taking in the gathered witnesses, the stern expression on Lord Edmund's face, the horror and betrayal evident in Lady Margaret's eyes, and Nathaniel standing quietly near the back of the assembled staff, his testimony now confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt. "I had no choice," Gareth said finally, his voice breaking with a mixture of shame and desperate justification. "My debts had grown beyond what I could manage. I faced ruin, complete and total ruin, and I saw no other path forward. I never intended for the blame to fall so heavily upon an innocent servant, only to deflect suspicion long enough to settle my affairs. Elena, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke, her voice carrying a quiet strength that drew every eye in the hall toward her. You never intended, she repeated slowly, and yet you allowed me to be cast out into a storm that very nearly killed me, allowed an entire household to believe I was a thief when you knew, with absolute certainty, that I was innocent of any wrongdoing. Gareth had no response to offer, his earlier justifications crumbling beneath the simple, undeniable truth of what his deception had cost her. Lord Edmund stepped forward, his expression hardening with resolve as he addressed his cousin directly. You will leave this household immediately, he said firmly. Whatever family loyalty I once extended to you has been thoroughly forfeited by your actions. I will consider carefully whether formal charges should be pursued, but regardless of that decision, you will have no further place within this family's affairs or protection. Gareth, recognizing the futility of further protest, offered no response beyond a bitter, resigned silence as two members of the household staff moved to escort him from the hall to gather his belongings before his departure. As he passed Elena on his way toward the door, he paused briefly, though whatever words he might have offered died unspoken, as he met the steady, unflinching gaze she directed toward him, a look that carried neither anger nor triumph, simply the quiet dignity of a woman who had faced injustice and emerged, finally, vindicated. Once Gareth had departed, Lord Edmund turned to Elena with an expression of genuine remorse. I cannot undo the suffering you endured, he said quietly, but I hope you will accept my sincere apology, along with whatever restitution might help restore some measure of what was taken from you. Thank you, Elena said simply. I appreciate your willingness to seek the truth, even when it meant confronting a painful reality within your own family. Lady Margaret, who had remained largely silent since Gareth's confession, finally stepped forward, her expression carrying visible shame. I judged you too quickly, she said, her voice unsteady with genuine remorse. I allowed the evidence presented to me to override any consideration of your character, built over years of faithful service in this household. I am deeply sorry for the harm my hasty judgment caused you. Elena studied the older woman for a long moment, recognizing the genuine regret in her expression, before finally offering a small, gracious nod. I accept your apology, she said. We all make errors in judgment, particularly when presented with evidence that appears, at the time, entirely convincing. I hold no lasting anger toward you, Lady Margaret, only relief that the truth has finally come to light. The tension that had gripped the hall throughout the confrontation began to ease as the matter reached its resolution, though the weight of what had transpired remained heavy in the air around them. Alaric, watching Elena navigate this difficult reckoning with such grace and composure, felt his admiration for her deepen further, recognizing in her response not weakness or lingering resentment, but a genuine strength of character that had allowed her to move through this ordeal without losing the essential kindness that defined her. As the household staff began to disperse, returning to their regular duties now that the matter had reached its conclusion, Lord Edmund drew Alaric aside for a private word. I am grateful for your involvement in uncovering this truth, Your Grace, he said sincerely. Without your investigation, this deception might well have continued indefinitely, with Elena bearing the unjust weight of accusation, while Gareth continued his manipulation unchecked. I am simply glad the truth has come to light, Alaric replied. Elena deserved far better than what she suffered, and I am relieved that justice has finally been properly served. As Alaric and Elena prepared to depart the estate that afternoon, the weight of the confrontation finally beginning to lift from their shoulders, Elena turned to him with an expression of profound gratitude. Thank you, she said softly, for standing beside me through all of this, for believing in my innocence when I had no way to prove it myself, and for pursuing the truth with such patience and determination. You never needed me to believe in your innocence, Alaric said gently. The truth of your character was evident from the very first moment I witnessed your quiet dignity in the face of that terrible injustice. I merely helped uncover the proof that would allow others to see what I had already recognized. They rode away from the estate together, the storm of accusation and deception finally settled, the truth restored, and something new beginning to take shape between them, born from the shared trial they had faced together, and strengthened by the trust and understanding that had grown steadily throughout their unlikely journey. News of Gareth's disgrace spread quickly through the surrounding countryside, as such scandals inevitably do, carried from household to household by servants and merchants, until the story had reached nearly every estate within the region. Along with the tale of Gareth's deception, came whispers of Alaric's involvement in uncovering the truth, and inevitably, speculation regarding his evident personal interest in the servant girl he had rescued from the storm, and subsequently defended with such determination. These whispers reached Alaric's own household staff within days, and shortly thereafter, reached the ears of his extended family, several of whom held strong opinions regarding the propriety of a duke's association with a woman of Elena's former station. His aunt, Lady Constance, a formidable woman who had long taken it upon herself to advise Alaric on matters of family reputation, arrived at his estate unannounced, barely a week after the confrontation with Gareth, her expression carrying the particular severity she reserved for matters she considered urgent. "I have heard the most troubling rumors," she said without preamble, settling into a chair in his study, with the air of a woman prepared to remain, until her concerns had been thoroughly addressed. "Rumors suggesting you have taken considerable personal interest in a former servant from the Ashford estate, a woman dismissed, however unjustly it now appears, for theft." Alaric regarded his aunt calmly, having anticipated some version of this conversation, given the inevitable spread of gossip following such a dramatic reversal of circumstances. "I assisted in uncovering the truth behind a grave injustice," he said carefully. "I fail to see how that constitutes cause for concern. The truth of the matter, and your evident personal feelings toward this woman, are two separate concerns entirely," Lady Constance replied sharply. "I understand you rescued her from a storm, and pursued the investigation that cleared her name. Admirable actions, certainly. But the rumors suggest considerably more than simple charitable concern, and I must ask you directly whether there is truth to these whispers." Alaric considered his response carefully, recognizing that evasion would serve little purpose with his aunt, who possessed a keen perception that rarely missed the truth beneath careful deflection. "I have grown to care for her deeply," he admitted finally. "Her character, her resilience, through terrible circumstance, her honesty and kindness, despite everything she has suffered, these qualities have earned my genuine respect and affection." Lady Constance's expression tightened with visible concern. "Alaric, you must understand the position you occupy within this society. A duke's marriage carries significant weight, both for the continuation of your family's legacy and for the political alliances that such unions traditionally serve. A servant girl, however admirable her personal character, brings no such advantages to a match. The scandal alone, should you pursue such an association formally, would follow you and any children resulting from such a union for the entirety of your lives. I understand the traditional expectations surrounding my position," Alaric said, his voice steady despite the weight of his aunt's concerns. "But I have spent years fulfilling those expectations, maintaining careful distance from genuine connection, in service of appearances and political calculation. I find, having encountered someone whose character I genuinely admire, and whose company brings me a peace I have rarely known, that I am no longer willing to sacrifice that possibility for the sake of traditional expectation." Lady Constance studied her nephew for a long moment, recognizing in his steady resolve something she had perhaps not expected to encounter, a genuine conviction that ran deeper than simple infatuation or momentary rebellion against societal constraint. "You realize," she said finally, her tone softening slightly though her concern remained evident, "that such a decision will not be without genuine consequence. Society can be cruel toward those who defy its expectations, and your position, however powerful, does not render you entirely immune to that cruelty." "I am aware of the potential consequences," Alaric said, "but I have also witnessed, through Elena's example, the cost of allowing fear of judgment to override genuine principle. She faced banishment into a deadly storm, rather than falsely confess to a crime she did not commit, holding fast to truth, even when doing so cost her everything she had. I find myself unwilling to demonstrate less courage in pursuing what I believe to be genuinely right for my own life." His aunt remained silent for a long moment, weighing his words carefully, before finally offering a slow, reluctant nod. "You have always been a thoughtful man, Alaric, more so than most give you credit for, given your reputation throughout the region. If you have considered this matter as carefully as your words suggest, then I will not stand in your way, however much certain members of society might object to your choice." "Thank you," Alaric said sincerely. grateful for his aunt's willingness, however reluctant, to extend her support, despite her initial reservations. "I would ask only one thing," Lady Constance continued. "Before you proceed further with any formal declaration of your intentions, allow me to meet this young woman myself. If her character proves as admirable as you describe, I will offer whatever support I can in helping navigate the social challenges such a union will inevitably present." Alaric agreed readily to this request, arranging for Elena to visit his estate the following week, so that his aunt might form her own assessment of the woman who had captured his heart under such extraordinary circumstances. In the meantime, he continued his regular visits to the cottage, sharing with Elena the various developments regarding Gareth's fate, including news that formal charges had ultimately been pursued, resulting in Gareth's departure from the region entirely to avoid the legal consequences of his actions, and his complete removal from any future position within the Ashford family's affairs. Elena, for her part, had begun considering her own path forward now that her name had been properly cleared. Lord Edmund had offered her a position of considerably greater responsibility within his household as a form of restitution for her suffering, an offer she appreciated, but found herself hesitant to accept, recognizing that her feelings for Alaric had grown into something she could no longer easily set aside in favor of returning to her former life of service. When Alaric mentioned his aunt's request to meet her, Elena felt a flutter of nervous apprehension, understanding immediately the significance of such a meeting and the judgment it likely represented regarding her suitability as a match for a man of Alaric's standing. "What if she does not approve of me?" she asked, her earlier confidence wavering slightly at the prospect of facing such scrutiny. "Then we will face that challenge together," Alaric said firmly. "But I do not believe you need worry excessively. My aunt values genuine character above simple status, whatever her initial concerns regarding propriety. I trust that once she comes to know you, she will recognize the same qualities that drew my own admiration so completely." Despite his reassurance, Elena spent considerable time preparing for the meeting, both in terms of her appearance and in steeling her nerves against whatever judgment Lady Constance might render. When the day finally arrived, she found herself standing before Alaric's imposing estate, considerably grander than anything she had previously encountered, feeling the full weight of the disparity between her own humble origins and the elevated world Alaric inhabited. Lady Constance received her in a formal sitting room, her expression carefully neutral, as she gestured for Elena to take a seat across from her. The conversation that followed proved more thorough and probing than Elena had anticipated. Lady Constance asking pointed questions regarding her background, her character, her understanding of the challenges that would accompany any formal association with Alaric. Elena answered each question honestly, refusing to embellish her circumstances or pretend toward qualities she did not genuinely possess. She spoke candidly of her humble upbringing, her years in service, the terrible injustice she had suffered, and the strength she had drawn upon to survive it, with her integrity intact. Throughout the conversation, she made no attempt to diminish the genuine disparity in their stations, nor did she express any ambition toward the wealth or status that association with Alaric might provide. "I do not seek his title or his wealth," she said finally, near the conclusion of their extended conversation. "I care for him because of who he is, beneath that title, the patience and genuine kindness he has shown me, the careful integrity with which he pursued justice on my behalf, even at potential cost to his own reputation. Whatever challenges society might present because of our different stations, I believe those challenges pale beside the genuine connection we have built together." Lady Constance studied her for a long moment, something in her expression finally softening as she recognized the sincerity behind Elena's words. "You speak with considerably more wisdom and grace than I might have expected, given your circumstances," she said finally. "I confess, having met you directly, I understand better why my nephew has grown so attached to your company. You possess a genuine strength of character that many born to considerably higher station entirely lack." Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her at these words, recognizing them as tentative approval rather than the dismissal she had feared. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "Your acceptance means a great deal to me, given how much Alaric values your judgment and support. I cannot promise that all of society will extend the same understanding I have arrived at through this conversation," Lady Constance said honestly. "You will face challenges, whispers, perhaps even outright cruelty, from those who value tradition and status above genuine character. But if you and Alaric are prepared to face those challenges together, with the same resilience you have already demonstrated through everything you have endured, then I believe you may yet find genuine happiness together, whatever obstacles society places in your path. When Alaric arrived later that afternoon to collect Elena and learned of his aunt's cautious but genuine approval, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not fully realized he had been carrying. The path forward remained uncertain, filled with challenges neither of them could fully anticipate, but for the first time, since he had watched that gate slam shut on a snowy night that now felt impossibly distant, he allowed himself to imagine a future built on the genuine connection he had found with the remarkable woman who had walked into his life through the most unlikely and dramatic circumstances imaginable. Spring arrived gradually over the following months, the last remnants of winter's snow melting away to reveal the green countryside beneath, and with it came a steady transformation in Elena's circumstances that she could scarcely have imagined possible during those darkest hours when she had collapsed alone in the storm, believing her life essentially over. Lady Constance's cautious approval had opened doors that Elena had not anticipated, gradually softening the resistance of other family members and acquaintances who had initially questioned Alaric's evident intentions. Not everyone within their social circle proved as understanding as Lady Constance had ultimately become. Elena endured her share of pointed comments and cool receptions from those who considered her origins an insurmountable barrier to any formal association with a man of Alaric's standing. She bore these challenges with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through the injustice of her banishment, refusing to allow the judgment of others to diminish the genuine happiness she had found. Alaric, for his part, proved unwavering in his support throughout these social challenges, never once suggesting that Elena should feel shame for her origins or apologize for the connection they had built together. His steady presence at her side during difficult social gatherings, his quiet but firm rebuke of anyone who dared treat her with disrespect, gradually established among their acquaintances an understanding that his regard for her would not be swayed by traditional prejudice, however persistent. Lord Edmund and Lady Margaret, having witnessed firsthand the depth of injustice Elena had suffered and the remarkable grace with which she had faced her ordeal, became unlikely allies in helping ease her transition into this new sphere of society. Lady Margaret, in particular, seemed determined to make amends for her earlier hasty judgment, extending genuine warmth and support that surprised Elena, given their previous relationship as mistress and servant. Throughout these months of gradual transition, Elena and Alaric's relationship deepened steadily, built upon the foundation of trust and understanding they had established during those first difficult days following the storm. They spent considerable time together, walking the grounds of his estate as the spring flowers began to bloom, discussing matters both practical and personal, discovering shared interests and values that reinforced their growing conviction that they had found in each other something rare and genuinely precious. It was on a mild evening in early spring, as they walked together through gardens just beginning to show their first colorful blooms after the long winter, that Alaric finally gave voice to intentions he had been carefully considering for some weeks. He guided Elena toward a quiet bench overlooking a small pond, its surface reflecting the golden light of the setting sun, and there he turned to face her with an expression of careful seriousness that immediately caught her attention. "Elena," he began, his voice carrying a slight nervousness that she found endearing, given how composed and steady he typically appeared. "These past months have brought changes to my life that I could not have anticipated on that stormy night when I first saw you cast out from the Ashford estate. I have come to value your presence, your character, your steady strength, more than I believed myself capable of valuing anything beyond duty and obligation." Elena felt her heart quicken, sensing the significance building in his words as he continued. "I know the challenges we face are considerable," he said. "Society will not easily accept such a match, and there will surely be difficulties ahead that neither of us can fully anticipate. But I find that I no longer wish to imagine a future that does not include you beside me, sharing both the challenges and the joys that life presents. Elena, I am asking whether you would consider becoming my wife, sharing not merely my title and my estate, but my life fully and completely, whatever obstacles society might place before us." Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion behind his words, and by the profound journey that had brought them to this moment, from the terror of that snowy banishment to the quiet joy of this spring evening. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I would be honored to share my life with you, Alaric, through whatever challenges and joys the future holds." The relief and joy that spread across his features at her answer settled any remaining doubt Elena might have carried regarding the depth of his affection. And as he drew her into a gentle embrace beneath the golden light of the setting sun, she felt a peace and happiness she had never dared imagine possible during those darkest hours, when she had believed her life essentially finished. Their engagement, once formally announced, generated considerable discussion throughout the region, as anticipated, but the scandal that many had predicted failed to fully materialize, tempered significantly by the widely known story of Elena's unjust banishment and subsequent vindication, which had already earned her considerable sympathy among those who valued genuine justice over rigid social convention. Lady Constance, true to her earlier promise, extended her full support throughout the preparations for their wedding, using her considerable influence to smooth over whatever residual objections remained among the more traditional members of their social circle. The wedding itself took place in early summer, a celebration that brought together an unlikely gathering of guests, from Alaric's noble relations and acquaintances to the modest household staff who had witnessed Elena's ordeal and subsequent vindication, including Nathaniel, whose honest testimony had proven so crucial to establishing the truth, and Mrs. Pruitt, whose kindness had sheltered Elena during those uncertain early days of her recovery. As Elena stood before the gathered guests, exchanging vows with the man who had rescued her from a deadly storm, and subsequently helped restore her good name and her faith in genuine justice, she found herself reflecting on the remarkable transformation her life had undergone since that terrible night when she had been cast out into the snow, believing her circumstances entirely hopeless. The ceremony concluded with quiet celebration, guests sharing in the joy of a union that had defied traditional expectation, to demonstrate the genuine possibility of connection, built on authentic character, rather than mere status or convention. Lord Edmund, present among the guests, despite the complicated history connecting their families, offered heartfelt congratulations, expressing genuine gratitude that some measure of good had emerged from the painful circumstances his own family's deception had originally caused. In the months that followed their wedding, Elena settled gradually into her new role as Duchess, approaching her responsibilities with the same quiet dignity and genuine care for others that had defined her character throughout her ordeal. She established, with Alaric's full support, several charitable initiatives aimed at supporting servants and household workers who found themselves facing unjust accusations or mistreatment, drawing directly upon her own experience to advocate for greater fairness and consideration within households throughout the region. Alaric, too, found himself gradually transformed by their union, the guarded distance that had characterized his interactions with others for so many years, slowly giving way to a warmth and openness that surprised many who had known him only through his formidable reputation. Those who had once whispered of his coldness and severity began instead to speak of his genuine kindness, his careful attention to justice, and the evident happiness that marked his interactions with the woman who had become his wife. Years later, when their own children asked about how their parents had first met, Elena and Alaric would share the story of that terrible storm, the banishment that had nearly cost Elena her life, and the remarkable chain of events that had brought them together through injustice and eventual vindication. They spoke of the darkness that had threatened to overwhelm Elena on that snowy road, and of the unexpected light that had found her in the form of a stranger, whose reputation for coldness had concealed a heart capable of genuine warmth and unwavering justice. The story became, over time, something of a local legend throughout the region, a tale told to illustrate that true character reveals itself most clearly, not through titles or circumstances of birth, but through the choices individuals make when facing injustice and adversity. Elena's quiet strength in the face of terrible betrayal, and Alaric's willingness to risk his own reputation and comfort in pursuit of genuine justice, together created a story that inspired others to look beyond surface appearances toward the deeper truths of character that ultimately matter most. And though the storm that had once threatened to end Elena's life had long since passed into distant memory, its legacy remained, a reminder that even the darkest circumstances can give way to unexpected light, and that true connection, once found, proves strong enough to weather whatever storms life might yet present. The gate that had once slammed shut behind her, banishing her into what seemed certain doom, had ultimately opened the way toward a life richer and more meaningful than she could have imagined possible on that terrible night when hope had seemed entirely lost.